The legendary 12th world chess champion Anatoly Karpov is currently 70 years old and has not played regular competitive chess in many years. However, at the recent Smyslov Blitz Memorial Tournament, he demonstrated that he still absolutely crushes it at the chessboard, even against some of the world's best active Super Grandmasters. Scoring 50% in a very strong event, he defeated Sergey Karjakin 1.5 to half and defeated the strong Grandmaster Maxim Matlikov 2-0. Ultimately, this event was won by Jan Nepomniachtchi, the current World Chess Championship challenger, but it is Karpov who everyone is talking about. Karpov once said, "Chess is my life, but my life is not chess." It's just fantastic to see that at the age of 70, chess is still an important part of his life, and he's still playing such great chess. Rashid Nejmetdinov once said, "He who analyzes Blitz is stupid." I'm not going to question the statement, but I am going to analyze Blitz, but very lightly. There are certainly inaccuracies in this game, but that doesn't detract from the overall beauty of the game. Karpov has white, Karjakin has black, and we get d4. Knight of 6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, a Nimzo Indian. Now, we see an interesting structure develop as black eventually goes after the bishop on the king side. After bishop g5, we get h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and knight e4. The knight is targeting the bishop and the queen, don't forget that. And after the capture of the bishop in just a moment, we are going to see an interesting pawn structure. Now, Stockfish isn't a big fan of this pawn structure that gives white the half-open h-file, but also concedes this kind of damaged pawn structure and a set of dark squared weaknesses over here. In fact, Karjakin could have exploited in some lines the dark squared weaknesses, but they never quite amounted to as much as one might have hoped if you're playing the black pieces. So knight d7, g4, a very nice use of the doubled pawns here to try and restrict the pawn structure, and Karjakin meets that by bringing his queen over, going to g6, and then adjusting the pawn structure in his favor by expanding with pawn to h5 in a little bit. We get a trade here, and now Karjakin has the open h-file over here, and he's looking to encroach on the king side. However, Karpov has the advantage on the queen side, and he's looking to expand over there. We get queen to e3, rook to h8, knight c3, queen to h4, and now this is very interesting, b4. Karpov is going to play a big strategy of grabbing space in this game, and it is going to work beautifully. Stockfish doesn't love it, but it certainly pays off, and even Karjakin wasn't up to the challenges of meeting this spatial expansion on the queen side. We get queen g3. By the way, queen f4 on this and maybe other moves was an interesting idea to try to exchange queens and get a favorable endgame and establish more control over the dark squares. Now, at this point and on a number of other future moves, the idea of c5 is interesting, and at some points, Stockfish is just about screaming for c5, saying that white can get a very big advantage by playing c5. But Karpov doesn't go for it. Instead, he looks for king activity over here on the queen side. He plays king b2 right away, and that king is going further up the board before too long. He's already thinking about a favorable endgame, and we're going to see further expansion, more space grabbing, and not breaking here with c5. Now, Stockfish doesn't love it, but it's a very interesting strategy, and again, it works out very well in the game. So we get rook to h1, king up to b3, pawn to a6, pawn to a4, king to b8, and now pawn to a5. As said, Karpov is expanding and grabbing space on the queen side and keeping his king active, well positioned for the coming endgame. Pawn takes a5, pawn takes a5, g4, knight to e2, hitting the queen, queen to h4, pawn to f4, pawn to e5. It's around this point, especially after this pawn captures and the knight hops into c5, that Karjakin gets his best advantage in this particular game. Stockfish is saying that king to a2 is the best move, but king b2 is actually played. It's hard to figure out where to put the king, and you can see that Karpov is thinking, at least I think he's thinking, about trying to keep the king closer to the center of the board for the endgame. Now, knight takes e4, pawn takes d6, pawn takes d6. Neither king feels very safe, very complex position. King to c2, Pawn to f5. This looks like a beautiful knight here on e4. Rook b1, creating some threats relating to the black king here. And now the queen needs to pull back. She could have pulled back to d8 or h7. Those would have been the best available moves. In fact, queen e7 as played by Karjakin is a bit of a mistake, because instead of knight c3 as played by Karpov, which makes sense and has the same basic idea as knight g3 would have been really, really strong here. This move hits the rook, takes advantage of the pin, and is also hitting f5, and it would have secured Karpov a very large advantage right here. Instead, he plays knight to c3. Of course, this is a blitz game. Everything is happening crazy fast, so inaccuracies are inevitable, and I'm only pointing out the ideas because the ideas are interesting, not because one would ever expect the players to see all the ideas that Stockfish is pointing out. So king over to c8, getting out of the dangerous b file. Knight d5, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen c7 check, king to b2. Such an interesting king position with a threat here of rook c1 pinning and winning the queen, which of course Karjakin's never allowing. King over to d8, queen b6. The queens are leaving the board. Stockfish calls 0.00, but of course there's no imminent draw. There's still a lot of action to be had from this position. It's very interesting. White's pawns further up the board as we transition into the endgame. They're going to be very dangerous. On the other hand, black has what might be the most dangerous pawn on the board, the g4 pawn, and it's interesting to see Karpov deal with that. At this point, king d7 is played, and this move is a mistake, and there's an interesting option that was missed by both players here. Great moment to pause your video if you want to try and find it. The missed tactic is bishop to b5 check, a discovery on the rook on h1. After pawn takes b5, you probably should trade queens just to simplify. King takes and rook takes h1. So that was a winning opportunity available to Karpov. I kind of like that the game didn't end that way because I like the end game that comes later. But that was available. Instead, we get the trade of queens here. King takes and bishop takes on a6, picking off a pawn here. But of course, it does feel kind of hard to promote the a pawn because black's king is in the vicinity over here. Rook h2, going after this g2 pawn, and of course if that pawn falls, which it is going to fall, then this pawn becomes quite dangerous. So bishop f1, knight to d2, forking the rook and the bishop. The rook moves with gain of time, attacking the king. King moves to b8, king c3. This king is starting to get active. It was further up the board earlier in the game. It's danced around a little bit, and now it's heading back up the board. Knight takes on f1, removing the defender of g2. Rook takes g2. Rook b1 check, and this rook is going active. It's a rook endgame. As you know, the most important thing in rook endgames is rook activity and also king activity, and white's playing for that right now. So king a7, rook b6, targeting the d6 pawn. Of course, you might think maybe the king shouldn't have gone over here and gotten boxed in. On the other hand, if you go the other way, the a pawn starts to feel more dangerous. So rook f2, rook takes d6, rook takes f4. Now, to be honest, playing through this game without Stockfish, I felt like black should probably be better here. Stockfish says 0.00, all rook endgames are drawn. But here black has connected passed pawns, which certainly feels like an asset. And black's king feels fairly well positioned to restrain both of these pawns. However, in this position, it turns out that the white rook's activity, it gets behind the pawns, which is always good in a rook endgame, and the potential activity for the white king are really big factors. So the rook goes behind the passed pawn right away with rook g6, rook to f1, and another interesting thing to think about here is who's playing for a win. Was Karjakin still hoping to win this game and avoiding lines that could have drawn? For example, in this position, Karjakin could have played pawn to f4 and said, all right, you can have this pawn, but then I take your pawn and this is a dead draw, right? You're never going to beat me in this position. Instead, there's I think a bit of playing with fire. King to b7, King c5, the white king is getting active and the black pawns do not feel dangerous. So this is already a difficult position. Karjakin could have defended here by immediately going for the checks that one typically sees in a rook endgame. The white king approaches the center of the board supporting this pawn and attacking these pawns, and it looks dangerous, but computer analysis shows that already in this position you can bring the black king up and you can hold that way, or you can continue to check and then bring the king up, and that's enough. Instead, Karjakin made a mistake that should have been fatal, although there's going to be one more opportunity. He pulled his king back, trying to think about dealing with this d-pawn, but now the king is totally out of play. And Karpov immediately senses that and plays rook g7, making sure the black king stays on the 8th rank. Karpov's instincts for rook activity, king activity, just shine. So rook g7, rook to a1 going after the a-pawn, king to c6, threat of mate, no time to take the a-pawn, rook c1 check, and as the king dances out of these checks, the king is going to approach these pawns over here. So king to d8, king to e6, another threat of mate, so check, and a pawn finally falls. Karpov has a pawn advantage, I think for the first time this game. Rook a1, king back to e6, again threat of mate here. By the way, a fun move here was instead of playing for the mate right away, you can push the a-pawn. Very clean win, because if rook takes a6, king e6, the rook is no longer saving the game with checks. It's now stuck over here, and this is just game over. So that would have been a nice win. Instead, we get king back to e6, rook e1 check. The king is dancing the other way now. Karpov brings it over to the queen side, and that's going to allow him to shepherd the a-pawn further up the board. King over to c8, and in this position, we can use table bases. We now have table bases on Chess.com, and we can say emphatically that the only two winning moves here for white are rook to b7, a very common idea when you're trying to promote a rook pawn in a rook endgame, or rook c7 check and then rook b7. Those are the two ways to win. We do get one slip here near the end from Karpov. It's king to a8, moving the king up the board. Here, there was a chance to save the game with rook b6, attacking the pawns from the side. So this would have held the game. There's no way for Karpov to win from here with this excellent move. Instead, Karjakin played the potentially more natural move, rook to d4, attacking the d-pawn from behind. So very common, you want to keep the rook behind the passed pawn. But in this case, it's a mistake because of rook c7 check, pushing the king away. Now the king can step out, and you're just looking to promote the a-pawn, so there's no time to take the d6 pawn. Once the king gets out from in front of the a-pawn and the a-pawn is able to push up the board, there's no hope. So there's a few more moves, some checks, but it doesn't change anything, and it is in this position, after king d5, that Karjakin resigns the game. So I hope you enjoyed that game. This is actually not going to be Anatoly Karpov's last competitive game. He's not only going to be playing Blitz chess in 2021, he is going to be playing the TP Siegmund event later this year, a classical Swiss system tournament. So that is really, really fun. I think it's Swiss system. I don't have the details right, but the main point is you'll be able to watch Karpov play some classical chess, and hopefully this game whets your appetite for that. If you want to see more of the Game of the Days, then simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.